What is going on, boys and squirrels? Your boy Skinny P Scroll Daddy, the independent variable, back at you, helping out the plebs. We're going to be teaching you guys how to make suspension today. Whipped up this nice Deegan replica from the Super Motor Doter Motocross. The nice vented, catch this guy on mods. I'm thinking about posting it on there. Thinking about it. A-Kit exclusive, unfortunately. But we're going to be going over suspension because some of you plebs literally are paying people for suspension that's not even like good anyway. So hopefully this is a video that will inform the people who are actually selling suspension to take a moment and try and learn how suspension works. You can always just have faith that something that somebody gives you is going to work, and placebos are a proven medical remedy. I always think it's better to have at least intention, expectation whenever you're going to do stuff like that. Let's just jump into it. So we're going to go to our garage. Here in my garage, just bought this new Yamaha 450. It's fun to drive in the Hollywood Hills. We're going to just have a quick overview of like how I view each one of these sections. You should go in order of this. You start with general, optimize your general to what you are very used to and comfortable with. Your drivetrain, because this is just going to be pegged to your track. And then you're going to go to your others menu and you're going to go with some basic that as it applies to the type of riding that you're on. General section, I think is like pretty ubiquitous to any single track. If you like grippier tires, you'll run the 3S's. If you like more slippery tires, you'll run the 53s. I always run the 33s. Tire pressure, the default tire pressure is the max grip that you're going to get. So any deviation from the default values for here is 13.1 PSI is going to result in less grip. Like just either it's going to be less grip on the front end, less grip on the back end. Find your tires, find your tire pressure, and for the most part, you will want to stick to that. Same with like brakes and stuff like that. You have plenty of options on these A-Kit bikes. Find what you like and pretty much keep that standard for everything that you do. We're going to look at the drivetrain. For the most part, you have your generalities between like motocross and supercross tracks. So obviously for supercross tracks, we're at lower total speeds. So smaller front sprockets, larger rears. For outdoors, higher speeds, you're going to want smaller rear sprockets, higher front sprockets. And so how I actually approach suspension. So one fortunate thing about the A-Kit bikes is that all the suspension theory that I'm seeking to inseminate your brain with, there's applied principles with the A-Kit bike. So every single bike comes with a default tune, MX tune, and a supercross tune. If we're gonna go just apply the supercross tune and we're gonna evaluate it against the motocross tune. So you'll see right here, front sprocket stays the same between the two, but the rear sprocket goes from, for the supercross tune, a 54 rear to a 49. So smaller rear sprocket means that it can spin faster for motocross. So that all makes sense. Now we'll go peep over to the others menu. You'll see over here that the only thing that changes is fork height and swing arm length. That's because things like rod length and fork offset is 100% subjective. It's gonna kind of control how your steering angle. It is similar to the linearity as far as lean control. So that's like another way to kind of taper it, tailor it to specific tracks. For the most part, I'm not that good. Leaving it constant, I feel like is the best move for 99% of people. Same with rod length. You'll see with rod length. So if we go just to test right now, and I change my rod length, I go up with it. Nothing changed in the rear sag. We're at 102. The bike's rear end is actually squatted down significantly more. If you're at a larger rod length, that means your swing arm stroke is going to extend deeper into the rear fender. So you're going to be naturally squatted more while still being able to obtain the same sag numbers. And these sag numbers, I feel like there's a lot of misconception with what these truly represent and why you want them to be where you want them to be. A lot of people do a lot of they'll optimize their sag numbers for a track. And that's somewhat true to reality, but it's only true to reality because we don't have that much refinement in real life to be able to customize this. For example, whenever we're dealing with suspension clickers in bikes, we have the luxury of being able to do single pound and half pound increments for our spring rates, up front and on the rear. And that's stuff that's just not available in real life. And I need to go one direction or the other. It's easier to see how one direction of a certain value is better suited for one type of riding. For example, swing arm length. So it's kind of not necessarily as intuitive to sit here and say I want to run a small swing arm length or a large fork height for supercross. But the counter to that is very, very obviously true, which is for outdoors, as being compared to motor, you will want to have a longer swing arm, because that's going to make the bike's wheelbase longer. It's going to make the bike more stable in high speeds, which is something you're going to want more in motocross. So consequently, for supercross, you're going to want to run lower swing arm lengths. And the opposite side of the bike to that is fork height. Fork height and swing arm length are very related to each other in like how they're applied. So fork height, this is the amount of fork that's sticking off the top of the triple clamp. So if you were to think about like a large fork height, means that you're going to scoot the fork up on the triple clamp right here, and it's going to drop the front end down a bit. So it's going to stink bug the bike out a lot more. It's easier to picture the opposite, which is if you run a zero fork height, for example, the top of the fork is going to be aligned with the top of the triple clamp, and that's going to give your bike more of a chopper pose to it. So let's say we run like all the way down to a zero fork height right here. You'll see that the front end picked itself up. So this is useful in motocross versus supercross. You'll want to do the reverse with it. So with the A-Kit bike specifically, we're just going to go back to default value. You'll see that all of the parameters are middle grounds. So you have a 0 to 20 range for fork height, and it defaults at 10. You have a 0 to 10 range for swing arm length, it defaults at 5. If we're going to be setting up for motocross, and I'm just going to say I enjoy these settings, I actually do. This default stuff over here is pretty good for me. With the track that I'm on right now, default drive ratios is probably going to be pretty good for me. And so I'm going to first go over into this geometry menu if I want to make my own setup for this. And so I'm looking at this track that I'm on, which you'll see in a moment. It's not like the highest speed track, but it is a motocross track. It's got the bumps and stuff like that. So I want to be able to withstand the chatter. And to do that, I need more wheelbase to account for it. I'm going to just go standard deviation in the direction that I think is going to be what I want. So I want more swing arm length. I'm not just going to go up from 5 to 6. I want to notice it. So I'm going to go to either 7 or 8. So we'll go to 8 right now. And then to balance this out, the front end, for motocross, we're going to want to scoot the fork down on the triple clamp. We want to go a lower fork height. And one way to keep this memorized is that this is actually reverse. So like if I go left, it actually increases this number. If I go right, it decreases this number. You know, versus like all of these, if I go right, it increases. These two are actually pegged in alignment with each other. So this one started off at 5, this one starts off at 10. If I'm going to go from 5 to 8, then I'm also going to want to do basically the same direction over here. This is just double. So I went up 3 from 5 to 8. I'm just going to go up from 10 to 4. And so this part is balanced. So we're going to go ahead and save right now. And what you'll see now is we've kind of deviated a bit from the default sag values. So we're pretty much for the most part at 160. And this is how all bikes are. And now with our just geometry adjustments, we are at 60 and 108. So we've added a whole bunch of additional sag to the rear end. Now we're going to want to get that sag back to 100 whenever we're done, because like your suspension is set up to tackle obstacles on the track, a expected range of suspension to deal with that. Both front and rear end, for the most part, and for all bikes, they have 300 millimeters. So to say the rear sag is 108 millimeters, it means that it's eating up just over a third of the travel, versus the front is, you know, about like 1/5 of the suspension travel. And that kind of makes sense too, because you always want the back end to squat a little bit. So our front end is perfect, like as far as like what we want to overtly do to it. We won't want to really make any intentional changes on the front side of it to balance it back out, but we will on the rear. So now that we have decided what we want to start with on geometry, we're going to go over to suspension, where there's some general principles I always like to apply here. And a lot of it is like easier to always think about things in terms of motocross and then apply your thinking 180 to supercross. So it's easy for us to think about motocross and stability. In real life, we have like larger increments on spring rate, but we also have more refinement in preload. So our preload adjustments are like 1 millimeter, but they actually do like a whole change more than like reality would on a single click. What I like to do right off the bat is define my spring rate preload relationship for the type of riding that I'm doing. Right now it's set to the baseline. Now, if we're going to be doing motocross specifically, so most people would think, okay, if I'm in supercross, I want more preload because more preload means more pop. And if I'm in outdoors, consequently, I want less preload. This is exactly 180 wrong thinking. It has nothing to do with what other video games have told you what preload is. Preload is the amount of initially applied loading on the spring so that you can achieve the sag number you're looking for. more. So since we have more refinement on our spring rate than we do on our preload, we're going to use our preload the way that we would traditionally use spring rate. And if we're doing motocross, we want to generally be softer. How do we achieve softer spring rates with what we have here? For your sag, this weight never changes. So if you put a softer spring in here and you still want it to be able to give you these sag numbers, you have to put more preload on the suspension. We're going to actually up the preload. So we're starting at 15. I'm now going to move this to 20 and I'm going to move this one to 20. And so we've now dropped below 100 on the rear and 60 on the front. And so if we want to get back to our baseline sag numbers, we are going to have to soften both front and rear to get ourselves there. So that's the next thing we'll do, is just like drop some spring rate on both and see if we can get ourselves to that number. So now you can see I'm at 161, plus or minus a couple numbers is like exactly fine. Big numbers means things are going to be moving faster. So what you want to prevent the rear end from just kicking you around everywhere. You want the rear end to be more dead, and you don't want it to be so lively as compared to Supercross. It makes sense then that our rebound, we're going to want to go down with our rebound on both front and rear. For motocross on compression, we actually want to soften our valve stack on the downstroke. You want to increase the speed of it. So we're going to go a standard deviation up. The next one is going to be oil level. This is the amount of air gap between the top of the oil in your fork to the very top of the fork itself. There's more oil, that means your circuits are going to be more effective. So in Supercross, you're going to be demanding more dissipation of that energy through your damping. You're going to want your damping circuits to take more energy out for Supercross than it needs to for motocross. And consequently, motocross tailored better at lower fork oil heights, because this is a fork oil gap height is what this is. Now on the rear, we have our high speed compression circuit. Where this manifests itself in regards to Supercross versus motocross is the whoop sections where you're going to notice this change the most. In outdoors, you're going to notice this in braking bumps, especially as you're coming into corners, because the back end is going to want to not settle down if this stuff isn't dialed in correctly. Supercross, and you're talking about high speed compression, this is like how much of the suspension gets used whenever an impulse is applied to the rear wheel. So like in that impulse loading, how much is it just going to allow the rear end to actually work? But for outdoors, what you'll notice is that is going to leave you kicking. The rear end's going to be kicking up like crazy as you're hitting chatter and bumps going into corners, and it's not going to let your back end settle as. So since we're doing an MX setup, we're going to want to drop to a lower value. We'll put us at 1 here. Everything is now set up here. And so what you want to do at the very end now is our final sag numbers to bring all of our theory together. So I'm at 100 rear, 62 front. We're almost there. So I need more stiffness out of the front end. I'm going to go up 1 click here and look at it. So we're at 60 and 100. This is exactly where I want it to be. And then from this point on, like this is pretty much the end of the video, because you can kind of infer from there. It's more particular to the track that you're on situations. So like right here, I got a little bit of chatter into that corner. Say you're on like an ARL track. Well, those ARL tracks are going to have like way more chatter going into the turns. So you may even want to turn down your high speed compression on the rear. You may want to add more fork oil, as in take oil away, so that it can not react so heavily with it. But for the most, you want to be kind of paying attention to how much the bike bottoms out. On a Supercross track, you know, you're going to need more resistance to bottoming, and you're requiring more force on the wheels to turn you more quickly in Supercross. Softer in outdoors, stiffer in Supercross. Always seek not bottoming out, and always try and apply all of your changes in groups. Think about what you're doing and then make a big enough change to invoke you to notice it. Like if you can't notice what you just changed, you should just go set it back to what it was before you changed it and go look for something else. And at the end of the day, the game is difficult. I know like my bikes make it very easy, but even still, you know, for those who have tried it, the game's still freaking hard to play. So no suspension that is going to be given to you is going to alleviate that. The only thing that's going to help if you just are starting off with a bad suspension setup from the jump. So my advice to that is don't ride the OEMs. This stuff is like all confusing, and it takes a long time to like truly like try to understand what's going on. And because there's principles being like hacking. So like if you have suspension that's too stiff, you'll feel the bike and like react really quickly, especially on impacts. Whenever you have suspension that's too soft, it can behave the same way too. If you run out of suspension, it behaves not different from whenever you run out of suspension. You basically are now on, you know, a solid brick, and that brick is just going to react elastically. Don't like beat yourself up if none of this stuff like just intuitively makes sense. There's so much going on with it. Number one thing that you can always fall back on is if you're on the 8 kits, especially the Supercross and Motocross tunes are proven to be very effective for 99% of riders. They're Troy Jan approved, speedy boys that have been on it. Yes, of course, like they do different things with their stuff, but I've yet to really find anybody who puts a concerted effort into like getting to know the tunes that has a problem with it, especially for newer players. It's fun to play around with, but like if you get lost, don't feel like you're gonna now be, you know, stuck in being held back because it's some mythical cloud like holding you down and making your bike crap. Just run the default setup. It's good on almost every single situation. If you want to be a little more intentional with it, motocross tunes on motocross tracks, supercross tunes on supercross tracks, and then from that point just dial in your gearing, and always just make sure you find the brake settings that work best for you. But anyway, I'm gonna go clobber Lomp. All right, whatever. I suck. Skinny P out.